Hey everyone, in the next few minutes, we're going to try and make sense of one of the most complicated and just world-changing events in all of human history, the First World War. Okay, so let's just dive right in with the big question. How does something like that even happen? Well, the answer, it's not simple. It's hidden in a continent that was basically a tightly wound spring, just waiting for something to make it snap.
So I want you to picture Europe before 1914. This wasn't a bunch of friendly neighbors, no. It was more like a tense chessboard of huge, powerful empires, and they were all fiercely competing for land, for resources, for global power. And for years, they'd been building these massive, modern armies, pretty much just waiting for an excuse to use them.
And at the very heart of all this tension was something called the alliance system. The best way to think about it is like a series of invisible tripwires all across the continent. See, nations had made all these secret promises to back each other up in a fight. That meant that one little, tiny regional argument could instantly drag half of Europe into a massive war.
And what you ended up with were these two giant, armed camps just staring each other down. On one side you had the Triple Entente, who usually just call the Allies, and on the other side you had the Central Powers. With the map divided up like this, any little fight was basically guaranteed to get a whole lot bigger, really, really fast.
So you have this whole setup just waiting for that one wrong move. And that move finally came on a summer day in a city called Sarajevo. Right there, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, this guy Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was shot and killed. And this single act of violence, this one moment, was the spark that lit the fuse on the entire European powder keg.
That assassination kicked off the exact chain reaction that everybody had been afraid of for years. You know, this alliance system, it was supposed to keep the peace, right? Well, it did the exact opposite. It became this unstoppable conveyor belt, heading straight for war.
And just look how fast the dominoes fell. First, Austria-Hungary blames Serbia, declares war. Okay, so in response, Russia, Serbia's big protector, gets its army ready. Well, that brings in Germany, who's allied with Austria-Hungary, so they declare war on Russia. Then, to get a good shot at Russia's ally, France, Germany invades neutral Belgium, and that single act pulls the massive British Empire into the whole thing. In just over a month, the entire continent was at war.
You know, everybody thought this would be a short, glorious war. The soldiers would be home by Christmas, they said. Wow, they could not have been more wrong. What they got instead was this new kind of industrial-scale slaughter that nobody had ever even imagined.
And this is where the tragedy becomes almost impossible to believe. You have generals using these old-school tactics from like the 1800s, ordering thousands of men to charge across open fields. But they weren't running into old muskets. They were running straight into the buzzsaw of 20th century technology, the machine gun.
And the result was this absolute hell on earth that we call trench warfare. Armies literally dug themselves into the ground, separated by this barren, terrifying wasteland called no man's land. And for 4 years, they lived in mud and filth, facing constant artillery shells, poison gas, and these suicidal charges that would gain maybe a few yards of land, but cost thousands and thousands of lives.
The scale of the death, it's just a number that's hard to even wrap your head around. 9 million soldiers killed in combat. An entire generation of young men just wiped out. When the guns finally went silent in November of 1918, the world was almost unrecognizable. It wasn't just that the war was over. The old world was shattered, and a brand new, much more unstable one was built from the rubble.
What happened was basically a political earthquake. Think about it. 4 huge, centuries-old empires just gone, vanished from the map. The German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, and the Russian empires all collapsed. And in their place, you got revolution, civil war, and this chaotic redrawing of borders that would basically set the stage for decades of future conflict.
And the total cost was staggering, way beyond just the battlefield. When you start adding up the military deaths, the civilian deaths, all the wounded, the economic ruin, you start to see the true scale of this global catastrophe. And this is how we get to that horrifying number of 20 million deaths, and probably even more.
You know, people at the time, they really hoped that a conflict this awful would make humanity reject war forever. They actually called it the war to end all wars. But here's the tragic irony. The harsh peace treaty that ended it, the Treaty of Versailles, put such crippling blame and debt on Germany that it created this deep, burning resentment and planted the seeds for an even bigger, even deadlier war just 20 years later.
So, you might be thinking, okay, that was over 100 years ago. Why does this still matter? Well, here's the thing. This wasn't just some historical event. The collapse of those empires, the way new borders were drawn in the Middle East, the social chaos, these aren't just relics of the past. They are the absolute foundations of the world we live in right now. And in so many ways, we are all still living with the consequences of the war that was supposed to end all wars.